Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another CompTIA Project Plus episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. In this episode, we're going to be looking at explaining our project management roles. And here to help us with that, we have Mr. Ronnie Wong. Thank you for being here today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me back on the show as we continue on to take a look at more of the CompTIA Project Plus, especially in the area of, well, resource management roles. Now, we have to actually be very careful here as we now have everything ready for the planning stages. We've got to remember that the schedule is not enough for us to keep everything on track. We also have we need to have an understanding of the way that resources are actually used and how we can actually assign them and manage them a bit better.
Ronnie, what type of resources might we encounter?
Oh, that's a great question here. So as we start to take a look, right, that we have multiple resources, you've got to remember that every resource is not going to be the same. So what we like to think in project management, especially when we're new at it, is that a project that we're assigned to, right, has a fresh can of resources. It's like we open the door and then everything is actually, fresh and real and that I have everything that I need. What you're going to end up finding out in reality, the majority of the time, not going to say every time, is that you rarely have everything that you need during the planning stage, and that means there's a lot of things that have to get coordinated and gathered together, and the types of resources that we tend to have to deal with are things like what we call material resources, it's equipment, as well as human resources too, and then we have sub-varieties of each one of those that we have to realize, okay? So let's make sure we go over an explanation of what each one of those are. They're fairly self-explanatory, but let's make sure we understand why they're actually that important that we keep track of them. First, when we talk about the idea of equipment, that's kind of the easiest one, okay? Equipment is something that we tend to actually use, and we're able to reuse again in our project, okay? So that's actually very good. That's something that we like to have on hand because having the right equipment at the right time allows us to be able to accomplish our project task, well, in a very timely manner and usually in a fairly cost-efficient manner as well. There is also, of course, material resources. Now, when you compare equipment resources versus material resources in this sense, well, the difference here is that material resources tend to be consumed during your project. So you may find out, let's say, for example, if you're in the construction realm of managing a project, what you may have to actually do is you may have to buy, let's say, lumber. I was trying to think of the right word. I couldn't remember what it was, right? So you may actually have to buy lumber to build the actual project of a home that you're constructing or whatever it might be, okay? Well, that resource is going to be used up in the building. So that resource is not going to be available next week. You might have to buy more resources to actually compensate for that. If you're pouring a foundation, it's the idea of something like concrete. It's going to be used as a consumable. As you start to do this, other things are also consumable. Usually we don't track it down to this level, but if you want to, you can. Things like nails that somebody might actually be using inside of that, caulk, for installing other things here, right? Wallpaper, glue, all these are consumables and things that we don't tend to think about, but they are actually going to be used up. And then, of course, there is finally the realm of human resources, which is normally where we tend to spend the majority of our time when we start talking about resources, because that is by far the most complex one that we have to deal with, because those particular types of resources, human resources, always variable in many factors. Those factors include, of course, skill level, okay, include their availability at that particular time, also include the amount of work effort that they can produce versus the ones that really can't produce. So there's a lot of variables when you do that. So when you start taking a look at some of the different types of resources, those are by far the most generic types of resources we can deal with.
Ronnie, do we have any total effort points that can be assigned to individuals?
Well, yes and no if you choose to, right? So in that sense, yeah, if you are one of those very detailed-oriented project management people, you might actually take every resource or every resource team that you know about and do what we've been talking about in terms of like the burn down rate and actually assign them effort points throughout the entire schedule that you're actually saying, I know that I can count on him for 10 points here and 5 points here. You can do something like that, but we don't generally tend to do that too often because as the bigger the project goes, it becomes a
tedious.
challenge to actually try and maintain that. It's sort of like fantasy football at that point in trying to keep track. It really is. It's more like that. Can it be done? Yeah, because people play fantasy football and they know exactly how to do this in their heads. I couldn't do it if you actually gave me a calculator and a program to do it, but other people can. So you can keep track of it that way, okay, if you choose to. But the breakdown that we also have with those resources, right, is not just the very fact that they exist and what I've talked about as far as their individualities and their characteristics, but is also the very fact that resources, as far as a project goes, tend to break down into two general types of resources. And they're actually considered either dedicated resources or shared resources at this point. So you do need to pay attention when you start thinking about this idea. So Cherokee, just for a moment here, what do you think that the difference is when we talk about dedicated resources versus shared resources? I hope the name gives it away.
Yeah, I think so. If I were a dedicated resource, then I would just have one particular function on one particular project, and I wouldn't have to worry about splitting up my time amongst different projects.
That sounds exactly right. So right there is fairly easy. So this is one of those things that it's logical, it makes sense when something like this happens. But as we start to break it down, let's talk about why these considerations are important, especially with shared resources versus dedicated resources. Dedicated is the easy one. And this is what Cherokee was pointing at. If it's dedicated, that means that this particular resource is available to you on your project and really only to you. It's like exclusive to you to be available for your project. And this includes things like human resources. If somebody is assigned to your project team and they are a dedicated resource, that means you can rely on them for 100% of their effort. So if you assign them to an 8-hour workday, you can actually assign them to 8 hours of total work on that particular workday if you choose to.
I can imagine some of this exclusivity could come at a price, especially maybe not individual resources like humans, but maybe even equipment or possibly humans as well.
Yeah, it really can, because there's a lot of things that don't come into play when we start assigning things like a full 8-hour day and a resource here. Dedicated resources, we have to actually think about other things too. So equipment is a great example that you mentioned here. So let's take for an example a generator, okay? Because that's one of the things I've worked with quite often here. So if you've ever owned a home generator, you kind of realize something. You can run them for a good long while, but there also needs to be downtime in between for maintenance and for other things. But if anything else, right, for that engine to actually have times of rest periods as well. We talk about that because it's actually very important. If not, you will wear out the equipment faster than it needs to be, and that piece of equipment will end up becoming a burden around you rather than something that helps you out. So when you start talking about, here's what I need this particular piece of equipment to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, well, it can happen, okay? But for you to do that, you really need two pieces of equipment. You're saying, why? Why would I need two pieces of equipment? Because when, especially in an example like the generator, right? If your generator is not designed to run like that, okay, that means you have to bring it down for downtime and for maintenance. So when you do that, and you need it still up 24/7, you have to have a second one there and ready and available to go.
Yeah, and the same rings true for any kind of, if you think about like a website, okay, a web server. And if you have an additional web server for the high availability, same concept applies there.
Yeah, no doubt that in the IT world, it really does apply just as well. See, this is where we come from different backgrounds. She's always focused on IT, which is great because that's where I love to. But I came from the diesel mechanicking background and from service truck and disaster recovery work in which, you know, you did when you had something like that. So when we were doing like Hurricane Katrina types of recovery work out there, well, we had a diesel generator that we would run, and we could run it for 10 hours a day, but we couldn't run it for 24 hours a day, and the only way we could is if we had two of them. And that's because we realized something with that little cheap engine that was on them, that we would replace the engine oil every 10 to 20 hours. So you didn't just go ahead and do that. If you need to bring it down, you had to bring it down for about an hour to replace all the oil to make sure everything was still functioning, and then you would oil it back up, turn it back on, you'd be ready to go.
All about that continuity.
It is about continuity. It is about making sure that happens if you need some resource like that. So dedicated resources, as much as it seems like, yes, I can do that, you really can't to a point. Same thing with human resources. So in a typical work week with human resources as a dedicated resource, you might think 8 hours a day, 5 days a week on a traditional standard type of project 40 hours of work, right? If you assign them to that in your project plan for 40 hours of work, you're not going to get 40 hours of work out of it. You might wonder, why not? Why? You said that 100% of their time and their effort can go towards the project. But there's other things that also go on in the life of that individual that they have to take care of. So let's take, for an example, instead, that as they come in during the week, you realize something, that they spend like the first 30 minutes, maybe to an hour, answering what? Inter-project related communications, okay? Updating the project plan or updating their particular portion.
Checking their emails.
Checking emails.
Going through that morning meeting.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff, right? And that adds up over that week. And now you said, oh, you're supposed to put in 40 hours, but Ronnie, when you turned in your actual work for the project time, you only turned in about 33 hours. Well, that's not bad, because what we normally do is we say, look, we need to really kind of make allowances for that. And you do. You need to make allowances for the very fact that other things in life have to go on that may revolve around your project but may not actually do with your project work. So dedicated resources are great because they are 100% yours to use, but you can't use them 100% of the time, which is weird. Okay? Then, of course, there are what we call shared resources. Just like what Cherokee was saying, that means they may actually be split between, well, 2 projects or maybe even 3 projects. And this is now what we actually have to deal with now. When you start thinking about this and what the ramifications are then for a shared resource in this sense, think about the idea of a human resource, right? If this is a shared type of human resource, the time is no longer just yours. So now if Cherokee and I are both project managers, and we need somebody to do this, whoever it is, and we actually have a project team member that's working on both of our projects, this is where Cherokee and I have to negotiate the time, okay? And because no matter what we say, even though Doc Brown is not here, he can't bring us back from the future, he definitely can't split 2 people to be in 2 places at one time.
I could imagine that our intra-project or, intra-company scheduling is going to be really key here, Ronnie, to make sure that we're not, over-allocating a resource.
There's no doubt that this is actually a key idea if we can. But if not, so let's say that somebody messes this up. That's why the negotiation is actually very important. The problem is if we try to negotiate and we both say, I have to have them on that same time, well, then it comes down to an arm wrestling match or something, oh, thanks. So you're saying you can beat me? No, don't worry about that. But overall, though, that's what we're also thinking about as well. Okay. Now, even though we're just talking about human resources, same thing has to be with equipment. So let's say it's the same thing here. Now, here it is. There is a piece of equipment that we both need to use. Well, this too has to be negotiated. And then also the same thing with material resources as well. And the material resources are the worst. The reason why is, I'm going to make Cherokee the bad guy here, is that Cherokee goes, I know something. Ronnie's going to need this many of this thing right now, but I don't know how many I need. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use as many as I want to, okay? Even though we're supposed to share this resource, okay? So if she does that, if Cherokee does that, whatever it is, okay, let's say it's pencils. I don't know why, but that's a good one. But if she says, this is how many, I'm just going to use as many as I need, and now I only have 30% of what I need, well, now I can't go back to Cherokee and say, Cherokee, you need to take those off of your project and bring them to me. Cherokee's going to go, not only are they actually in my project, I already used them up. It's done. You don't even have access to them anymore. So that's why material resources are the hardest to manage when they have to be shared or negotiated in this point. Once you have shared resources, there is no assumption that you can make as a project manager as to their availability. So it's very key then that we actually understand that there's a lot more at play than just saying, here's a resource I need for my project, okay, I'm going to assign them to this amount of time without considerations depending on how big your organization is and what type of resource you have.
And usually in those larger organizations, you would have someone dedicated to like a stockroom clerk or something to help keep a good track on all, like a running tally of all these items.
This is where your project management office should come into play and should help you out. But it doesn't mean that this always happens because remember, not every organization has a project management office. The larger the organization, the more likely it is, but at the same time, a resources availability among shared resources is very difficult to negotiate at times. Don't get me wrong, people can be very nice if they have wiggle room in their project schedule. If there is no wiggle room in their project schedule, people are cutthroat. Is what it comes down to be.
Ultimately, they're the ones held responsible, right?
Right, and so I'm not going to say that it doesn't happen, but yeah, you just have to negotiate those things out. So that's where it may be where you're going, okay, I can push my project schedule back a day or 2 days here, but then you have to actually go, all right, Cherokee, can you move your schedule up 2 days here so that it can accommodate and that we can both get our projects done? If Cherokee says absolutely, then you may have negotiated this deal. Cherokee says no, you'll get them when I'm done. That's it. Well, now, again, like I said, it comes down to that arm wrestling match in which I'm going to say that Cherokee will not win that one with me, but she may. So that's one of those things where you're just negotiating something like that out here. So from that point, that means we have to actually enter in kind of a weirder realm of things that we call resource allocation is where we actually have to tend to head into that element then, okay? So knowing about those fundamental, ideas that we have we have equipment, material, and human resources, okay? And that all of those can either be shared or they can actually be dedicated. That helps out, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, and that's where we're actually heading next, all right? So in the realm of resource management then, let me get my computer back up. I talked so long that my computer logged out, and I can't remember my password. Who would figure?
It happens.
Yeah, it really does, especially when you can't remember anything.
We only have 5,000 to remember.
I know, yeah, tell me about it. So resource allocation then, okay? When we start talking about resource allocation, here's where it gets tricky, Cherokee, okay? Is that not only do we need somebody on our project schedule, we might actually find out that we need more than one of somebody, okay? Not only will we find that out, we might actually find out that we need them on this date, but not on this one, okay? We might then also find out that we need them to actually be working like this particular many hours, and they can only do this many, okay? So this is where that idea of resource allocation comes in that we have to actually be very careful of. If not, we will end up over-allocating the resource, and assigning and scheduling a resource due to their availability can end up kind of being more of a nightmare.
You mean you scheduled me to work on the project during my vacation?
Yes, that can happen very easily, and the reason why is that even though you swear that you keep track of the vacation, you might find yourself in that pinch. Now, when that happens, that is something that we do call over-allocation, and it doesn't tend to show up that way, but in most project management information systems, it shows up as an over-allocation. In other words, they're scheduled to work when they're not supposed to be working during their particular time off is what ends up happening here. So we need to be able to figure out first how many resources that we need, okay, for a particular a task that we have for our project. And we also need to figure out what roles they're going to play on those particular tasks as well. And then at the project management level, we'll talk about something else a little bit more where we talk about the idea of quality types of resource assignments too. So let me show you an example of what we might have to be able to do, and it's something that we call the responsibility assignment matrix is what we actually need to take a look at here. Now, you don't have to do this for every single thing on your project unless you really don't know, okay? But at this point during my planning, as I'm still trying to figure out how many things I need to be able to have my work breakdown structure, and I need to know what resources I might need to work on my work breakdown structure here. So here in this example, let's say it's a website development project. I have somebody in marketing, designing, a test server that I need, a programmer, a user experience tester, as well as a copywriter too. So you know, if I'm the project manager, let's say I have no skills in the background of web development at all for a website, okay? Well, whatever 8.1.1 is, this is where I might go to my project team leader in that particular one for 8-1-1, I call it point 1 here. I might say, all right, how many marketing people do you need for your particular task? And they might tell me, I don't need any. Great. What about designers? Well, I need at least one designer, 2 would be better. So let's just go ahead and say 2. Okay? Do I need a test server? I might find out I need a test server. So, and then maybe I don't need actually 2 designers. I need 1 designer, but I need 2 programmers to help me work that out. And then the user experience tester, it'd be ideal to have its own dedicated resource, but if not, I may just reuse one of the programmers here, but let me just go ahead and say, ideally it would be one. And then a copywriter, let's say that here that the designer, the front-end designer and the copywriter can be the same. Let's say here, okay? So now you go back through, and this is what you start to do, is you start to realize how many of these resources you need for a particular task. And you can go in then to the second one and do the same thing here, where you might realize you're not dealing with marketing yet. And at the designer level, he's still working. Test server, you definitely continue to need. Here you have this one, and then this one, and then this one still, okay? After a while, what should happen is as the project continues to progress, you might find out that marketing becomes more important. The design work is done. The test server is still working because we need them. The programmer is still working because we need them. But now let's say that the user experience tester don't really need anymore. Copywriter, let's say that we really don't need him anymore. And now you can start adding this up and figuring out how many resources do you need to have available for your project. So this gives you at least an overall round of numbers that you can say and then say, all right, I need at least one marketer. I need a designer. I need one test server, a programmer, how many that you need. And you can go to your project management office and see if they can help you to get those resources available to you, or you can go out and try and find them on your own. But now you have a general concept of how many that you at least need for every work breakdown package that you have, okay? The workable unit that you have available, and then you can start assigning resources from that point. Now, just because I have the available numbers, okay, now in my head as far as planning goes, what role do they really play besides the one that we've given them? Well, it comes down to a couple of other things that you might also have to be able to do, which is what you also know as what's called the RACI chart, or RACI, however you want to pronounce it. And this, of course, is an acronym for responsible, accountable, conform, or consult, excuse me, and inform. I was trying to make them rhyme. I don't know why, but I was. So consult and inform. So now let's say that here it is. Here are the different roles that I actually had from the other chart over here on the left-hand side. And now I've actually assigned the resource to them, and these are people that work with us. So there we go. Okay. So at this
I know
point
those
here,
people.
yeah, you do know those people, don't you? Okay. So now what can you do? Well, you want to make sure that everybody understands here. Okay. So the marketing person, what role do they have in conjunction with, let's say, Erin? Okay. Well, Erin's particular role in marketing may be that she is actually the one that is accountable for that. Okay. Rob is actually going to be the consultant here, and let's say that let's say responsible. So they're actually going to do the work on that marketing here. And then let's say Dustin here, he is actually going to be, let's say, accountable because we're consulting here. Thomas is accountable, and then Angie is in the inform role. Okay. So when it comes down to Erin's particular role here as the marketing or SEO and web design here, Erin knows that she is responsible for taking care of that. But if she needs help, she knows who to consult. Okay. And then who is she answering to? Let's say it's Thomas, because I didn't know who else to put it here at this point. So you might actually find out it is Thomas, and then who's supposed to be consulting in that. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's change it backward, because like Angie is normally who we go to actually do any of that stuff. So we'll do it this way. Okay. So then you'd go down and you'd actually fill that out for, well, all your resources. This way, when somebody asks, okay, well, who is actually responsible for setting up the server? And here it is. You've got, let's say, 40 different WBS structures for your work packages here. Well, can you remember that? I wouldn't. I wouldn't be able to remember exactly who was responsible for setting this up. But being able to have something like this, where I've quickly done this and walked through, I can simply come here and look for that letter R.
Yeah, you don't even have to contact anyone.
Nope.
By removing that question, you just go ahead and pull this up, and there you go.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the great thing about using some of these tools that are really set up for us to be able to understand the way that resources also need to be allocated to help us out to ensure what we need to do. So, you do have quite a bit of information here that you can take a look at when you start to at least use something like that responsibility assignment matrix to give you the numbers that you need. And then, of course, every single design role or person or resource that you need as far as their role goes, you can actually say, here's exactly how they're going to end up working in the project and working together. You may find out that there may be some of these other ones, like the setup the server. There may actually be only this. Okay? So ideally, it would actually be multiple people here. Okay? So it might be where you might have consulting, and then informing that it's done might be Thomas again. He might be the one coordinating on the other side of getting everything done. You may not have multiple, where everybody's actually filling in on that task as well. So there's a lot of this that you can actually end up doing where it can actually work, and this way it's a very quick and easy reference for allocation of resources that are available. Okay?
All right.
All right, so what does that lead us to then? Well, as much as we'd love to say, okay, that every resource, whether shared or dedicated, okay, is going to be available 100% of the time. The other thing that we also have to deal with in terms of resources is the idea of what we call resource shortage, okay? When it comes down to the realm of resource shortages, it happens more often, okay, by far with shared resources. And that's because, well, if they are only working on one other project, well, they're probably actually busy with that other project, okay? They're working on more than one project, they're probably divided in their focus anyways, so you actually do have less of that. It does happen very rarely though, okay, when there are item types of resources, and you might be wondering, like, why are item types of resources or material types of resources, again, a little bit more rare? That's because you don't tend to have a shortage of them because you either have them or you don't, okay? And so usually they're consumed up, and that's why you also have that. Also, you tend to have resource shortages when resources are in high demand everywhere. So when you start to go, oh, I know exactly what I need, and then you realize it's the most popular thing on the market right now.
I want that same individual.
Yep, you want that same individual, or you want that same particular item that everybody is looking for right now, whatever it might be.
So what would happen in that situation? How would someone go ahead and, I guess, would you triage almost?
You would have to, or you'd have to bribe somebody, is what you'd have to do. So you'd think I'm joking. No, I am joking. I'm joking. But overall, though, yeah, you'd have to negotiate some way if there's a particular shortage, especially with an individual, where, you might have to work out something else. And it's one of those unusual things where resource shortages, you just have to deal with it. And most of us, the way that we deal with it is we tend to go ahead and we make accommodations for a resource that's in short demand right now so that we can get them a little bit later on. But then you have to actually plan out your schedule that way. You might find out you don't have anything to do except what's actually happening here too. And also, when you try and actually get the resource at the last minute, never a good thing on a project when you go, yes, okay, Cherokee will be available. I know. Oh, she's not available. Crud. So when you wait until that last minute, it's also something. So what does it come down to? Well, shortages, right? We can cause them by waiting the last minute. We can cause them, again, by not actually being able to negotiate out what we really need to. So that can happen. But marketplace forces do tend to, have a play in there as well when they're shared and they can have their time negotiated, or whatever actually is negotiated. You might find out a competitor of yours goes, so that Ronnie can't finish his project, I'm going to buy up all the green paint as well. I should say like sticky foam paint is what I should say, because I know like Peter, one of our guides here, he bought like every single bottle of spray adhesive, I think in the 2 or 3 counties is what I remember here. So nobody else who was doing any arts and crafts that week.
Yeah, and I mean, even with this last hurricane, you saw that with gasoline, you saw that with water.
Yeah, and so the same thing then with projects as they happen. This can be fairly, one of those unusual occurrences where you have to just deal with it. And this is where you end up delaying your project, for the time until, that resource may be available. If not, you may have to find a replacement instead. An alternative to help you out here, okay? All right, now, one of the last things we want to talk about, we're going to end up breaking this, I think, into kind of a part 2 here as I start to take a look. is just a basic idea of when we talk about resource allocation. We already mentioned it, but let's kind of mention this again just briefly. Whenever a resource is assigned to a time that they are not supposed to be working, they're considered over-allocation. Now, over-allocation can happen as far as a schedule goes, on a daily basis, or it can happen on a weekly basis. You can have those where they're actually over-allocated on an hourly basis, but normally most projects don't tend to work that way. I'm not saying that none of them do or can't, but all of them can, but usually we tend to actually try and see it on a weekly basis, if not on a daily basis here, okay? If you generally have just a standard project and you consider a single human resource working on your project as being a standard 8-hour workday, if you assign them to 10 hours of work that day, okay, then what is going to happen is you're going to be considered, that resource is going to be considered over-allocated. If you have a 40-hour work week and you assign them to 41 hours of work, that resource is considered over-allocated. You might be wondering, why is this important? It's important in terms of the cost of what your project ends up running.
Overtime.
Overtime, yeah, and that's why we actually do have to pay attention here, is overtime is actually a big one when you don't pay attention. Assigning resources on an overtime basis is actually allowed. The reason why is that you may actually be under a time crunch, in which you go to that resource and say, I really do need you to work overtime on this, and you're authorized to have all the overtime you need to complete this. And so if they're willing to do that, and you're willing to do it, you're willing to pay for it, then it's actually up and available. It's not always bad, but it's bad if everybody is actually over-allocated.
Yeah,
okay?
you see this a lot in the energy industry, especially if they have particular units that are down and they're not able to go ahead and produce the company's energy. They're like, look, we need to get this unit back up online. Let's go ahead and put forth all of the resources we have available just so that we can continue to be productive.
All right, so let's go ahead and just take a look at a couple of other things since we're still here. And I think we're just going to go, even though I said we'll probably break this up into part two, we're probably just going to take a look at the last few items and try and just put it all in here, because if not, it's going to be a really short part.
All right, Ronnie,
two
you're
here.
the boss.
All right, so let's take a look. The other thing that we also need to consider in terms of resource assignment is not only, of course, who's actually going to be responsible to whom and how many resources do I need, but also in the resource assignment itself, there has to be priorities and, of course, an understanding of what we call resource qualities. Okay? So every organization that runs multiple projects tends to have a matrix like this that they call a resource assignment matrix. Now, normally this is done at the managerial level more than anything else, and not really done at the individual resource level. But so here's how it works out. Now, not everybody does it this way. Here's how I kind of envisioned it. So we have, of course, the idea here of priorities, whether it's considered a high priority for my company, down to a low priority, okay? So I just did high, medium, and low. And the same thing with what we call resource quality here. Now, before you kind of jump down my throat about, well, what's considered a qualified or a quality resource or not? Usually what we're talking about here is dedicated versus shared, full-time versus part-time, okay? So that's what we mean by the idea of quality resource here. It's not that, oh, this person is so much better than Ronnie. That's not what we're talking about.
Maybe like a full-time employee versus a contractor?
Yeah, it could be even something like that if you choose to distinguish it in that way, okay? So if your company does work on multiple projects, there has to be an assignment of both, okay? What is the quality of resource that you need working on that project, and what is its priority as well, okay? Well, those are considered projects that we need to protect because they can influence the collateral, goodwill of your company, okay? So in that sense here, you tend to assign who is willing to protect your company's image and who is willing to protect your company's assets to that resource. And so that's when you actually have a high here where you actually go, all right, who is actually going to be protective of that? And that's normally going to be a full-time, dedicated project manager, full-time, dedicated functional manager of my company, if I have that. Same thing here, when it's high and medium, you also assign the same type here. And when you have a medium and high as far as priorities go, these are the ones that really go towards advancing the image of your company. Okay, that's what happens. Now, Notice that over here though, if my priority is high, but I really do not have any resources that are really left, I can actually go ahead and do this where I assign a full-time project manager and a functional manager to help me out here, okay? But it may not be that they are actually going to be just dedicated to that one project. Now full-time here means full-time, but they could actually be managing multiple projects at the same time, but they're considered full-time resources, okay? Same thing here on medium and low, it's going to be part-time, low and low, of course, part-time, and then you start seeing this. And
So Ronnie, would that go to our over allocation for those 2 full-times?
Yeah, it would. It would actually end up doing something like that as we choose to. Now, only the medium and medium. This is the one where you're in that gray area, right?
Okay.
Is this important? Is it not? This is when you actually choose and pick. You're very selective about who you choose to actually be able to do this, but this is something else you do want to pay attention to when you start taking a look at the idea of assigning the quality of resources. How do you know actually who should be full-time, who should be a contractor, who should be what? This is the way that you tend to do that. And as the resource becomes more trusted, then they actually tend to move up to these projects over here, and the rest of these are actually left kind of at the side as well. Okay? So those are some of the things that we also have to deal with in terms of resource assignments too. Also, every company that works with, let's say, contracted resources also have access to what we call benched resources as well. Okay? These are normally resources that are available to the project, but they're not really assigned to your project yet, but they can be if we actually need to. They're not normally part of a project plan. Benched resources are not something we should count on. In other words, they shouldn't be included in our project plan. They should be when we need them to be, but they're not actually going to be a part of it. So if we need somebody else to come in and help, then we actually can rely on what we call benched resources to help us out. And usually that is from a company that's contracting to us as well. And then we also have to remember that in allocations, we have to figure out this idea of what we call inter-project dependencies, okay? So let me kind of give you a very wonderful example of this idea of inter-project dependencies, okay? When one project ends up building upon another project to deliver our overall project and product. This building is a great example. The studios that we have here is a great example. Every single thing that you're actually seeing right here is actually a result of multiple projects. Our backdrop that you see right here, the camera work that you're actually seeing, the actual overall nature of the way that we're presenting the information, the lighting that's actually in our room. All these are actually multiple projects that have come together for one element. And they are dependent on each one because without all those projects really working together and in the end result here, dealing with the integrators that we had and all of the contractors that we had here, it wouldn't have actually come through. So it actually does require
Ronnie, you look
quite
great,
a bit.
but I can't hear anything you're saying.
I know, yeah, that would be terrible. Yeah, so when you start to see this here, the very fact is it does require integration to make it all work, and that's where we do have to kind of make sure that everything meshes together. So thinking about all of that is really kind of some of the roles that you as a project manager must consider when you start taking a look at resource management types of things that have to go on for your project as well.
That really has been a plethora of information, Ronnie. You were able to go ahead and help define all of our different resources. We were able to look at human resources. We were able to look at our equipment and material resources, as well as actually differentiate between shared resources and dedicated resources. You also showed us some really great tools to help us prevent any kind of resource allocations. We could go ahead and allocate those resources efficiently. We don't have to worry about any kind of resource shortage. And then, you know what, if we do have resource shortage, we also have those benched resources that we can go ahead and rely on if we need to. So that was a lot. Thank you guys for tuning in today. Hopefully I'll see you in the next episode here. We have more Project Plus coming your way. So thank you, Ronnie, for everything today. I'm Cherokee Boos.
I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.